My name is Vivian and I'm a 32-year-old. I'm Vivian, I'm 32 and I'm married to Mark, who is also 32. We've been married for 6 years and we don't have kids yet, but we're planning to start a family soon. Mark and I met at university and from the moment we met, I knew he was the one. He's charming, ambitious and incredibly supportive. It was just your typical love story. We spent hours chatting about our dreams, laughing like crazy and falling hard for each other. Fast forward a bit and we decided to live together. We found a cozy apartment downtown and started building our life. Those early days were a mix of excitement and challenges. Mark was working hard at his job trying to climb the corporate ladder, while I was doing the stay-at-home mom thing. At the time, we were living the dream. I was a stay-at-home wife and made our place feel like home. A few years down the road, we decided to tie the knot surrounded by family and friends. Everything felt perfect, like we were on top of the world. But little did I know my stupid mistake was about to rock our world in ways I never imagined. Years went by and things were even better. Mark had soared up the corporate ladder, and our financial situation was pretty darn good. I was still holding down the fort as a stay-at-home wife. I was a stay-at-home mom and things were going well, but let me be honest with you folks. With Mark's job keeping him busy, I found myself feeling pretty lonely most of the time. Don't get me wrong, we enjoyed our time together, but between his long hours and business trips there were plenty of moments when it was just me and the tea for company, but I couldn't complain because that was the only downside to our otherwise perfect life. As they say, life was good, but somewhere along the line I started to get bored. I mean, don't get me wrong, I loved being a stay-at-home wife, but I also craved a bit of variety. At the time, I was really happy with my life. I loved being a stay-at-home mom and I enjoyed cooking meals for Mark and pursuing my hobbies. But there comes a point when routine starts to feel like a prison. Mark was out there, I was a home mom, watching our beautiful home transform into a cozy nest, cooking meals for Mark and having the freedom to pursue my hobbies. It was all great, but there comes a point when routine starts to feel like a prison. Mark was out there conquering the business world while I was stuck in this suburban bubble, feeling like I was slowly fading into the background. I missed the excitement, the thrill of new experiences and the sense of purpose, beyond just keeping the house in order. I tried to shake things up. I joined a book club, took up painting classes and even started a little side hustle selling homemade candles online. But no matter what I did, there was always this nagging feeling of emptiness. It was as if something was missing from my life. Then there were the nights I spent lying awake in bed, listening to the rhythmic sound of Mark's breathing beside me. I wondered if this was all there was to life and if I was destined to spend the rest of my days. I was stuck in this suburban purgatory, yearning for something more. I should have talked to Mark about how I was feeling about the loneliness that grew day by day, but I didn't want to seem ungrateful. Mark was trying his best. He was busy, sure, but on the few occasions and days he was home, he always made sure to devote his total attention to me. His hugs were warm, his kisses tender, and his laughter infectious. Even when he was buried under a mountain of work at the office, he didn't call just to check in and make sure I was okay. It was those little gestures that kept me going and reassured me that no matter how busy life got, I was still his top priority. But despite his efforts, the lonely one lingered, a constant companion that refused to be ignored. Little did I know it was about to push me into making a grave mistake. That was when I met Jackson. Jackson was the plumber. I had honestly never met him before, but we had a little issue, and my husband had to call. My husband was busy, so I was the only one at home when Jackson arrived. He came with his toolbox in hand and a friendly smile on his face, which put me at ease right away. I couldn't help but notice how attractive he was, with his rugged good looks and easygoing charm. It was a stark contrast to the suits and ties of the corporate world that Mark was always clad in as he went about fixing the issue. We started chatting, and it was easy to talk to Jackson. Before I knew it, we were laughing and joking like old friends. It felt good to have someone to talk to who wasn't wrapped up in their own world of deadlines and meetings. But as much as I enjoyed our conversation, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at my insides. Here I was enjoying the company of another man while my husband was out there working his butt off to provide for us. I brushed off the feeling, chalking it up to harmless flirting. After all, it wasn't like anything. I had no idea that Jackson would turn out to be so important to me. He was just the plumber I'd met by chance, but he was a great guy. I didn't think anything would come of it, but he fixed our sink really quickly and he was good at it too. After he left, I figured that would be the last I'd see of him, but then I started bumping into him all over town. Our town wasn't huge, but it wasn't tiny either, you know the kind of place. You might see someone you know at the grocery store, but not everyone you know every time. So it was kind of surprising to keep seeing Jackson around. The first time was at the grocery store, not long after he fixed our sink. I was pretty surprised to see him there and even more shocked when he called out to me. But then I thought it was quite silly of me to be surprised. It was the grocery store after all. Everyone came here to shop. I approached him and we exchanged greetings. He flirted with me. He even complimented my hair, in clothes that made me smile. I had just done my hair and my husband hadn't even noticed, but Jackson had noticed. I was flattered. Jackson was very handsome. As we chatted, I found myself drawn to his easy smile and charming demeanor, despite the awkwardness of our brief encounter. Jackson had a way of making conversation flow effortlessly. It was as if there was an invisible force pulling us towards each other, creating a magnetic connection. We had a strong connection that made it hard to part ways. I felt a bit of excitement mixed with guilt, as I was married and these feelings were inappropriate. What would my husband think? I hadn't physically cheated, but it was emotional cheating. I tried to brush it off as mere attraction, but there was undeniable chemistry between us. Looking back, I realized that attraction wasn't love. It was lust, plain and simple. Lust grows, you know, and the neglect and loneliness were starting to get to me, though I didn't fully realize it at the time. After that day, I started running into Jackson more often. It seemed like everywhere I went, there he was. I even bumped into him at the local gym. Sure, we had a home gym. Mark was making good money, as I mentioned, but I found myself drawn to the public gym. It was partly because I craved human interaction in the midst of my loneliness. I also enjoyed the motivation that came from working out alongside others. Being alone in our home gym often left me feeling lethargic and uninspired. But when there were others around, I found myself pushing harder, fueled by the energy of those around me. Plus, I liked the opportunity to people watch, even if I was too shy to strike up conversations. So there I was at the gym, feeling surprised to run into Jackson again. We exchanged surprised greetings. We were both surprised to meet again, so I told him I'd never seen him at the gym before. He said I probably just didn't know him. We chatted for a bit longer than we did at the grocery store. After that, I started going to the gym regularly. I liked it, but I didn't go as often as I would have liked. It wasn't because I was busy, but because I just got bored. Sometimes, though, because of Jackson, I started going every day. I noticed that Jackson woke up super early to get to the gym, so it would still be very quiet by the time he arrived. So, you know what? I started doing that too. It was as if I was just unconsciously gravitating towards him. I would pretend to walk by him just to strike up a conversation. I noticed he did that sometimes too. Jackson and I became very close friends. We realized we had a lot in common. Jackson was funny and he was funny and good-looking, and I craved human interaction. I convinced myself that we weren't doing anything wrong, we were just friends. We started going out for dinner after a workout to decompress. We said we did all sorts of activities together and always justified it by saying we were just friends. Whether it was flexing at the gym, grabbing dinner, or simply spending time together, we chalked it up to our friendship. At some point, though, I knew deep down that what I was doing was wrong. I was becoming emotionally invested in Jackson, and that in itself felt like cheating, but I was way too far gone. I needed the interaction, it was a craving. It all finally came to a head one day when Jackson started complaining about he said he didn't like the public gym because it was always quite noisy. I knew I shouldn't have done this, but I made the most stupid decision ever. I suggested that Jackson use our private gym at home, and he was very happy about it. He thanked me profusely and expressed his genuine excitement. Jackson was really excited about the idea and asked me why I never used the private gym at our house. I just brushed it off, saying that I enjoyed people watching and the motivation from working alongside others at the public gym. To my surprise, he nodded in understanding. As our conversation continued, I mentioned that I would have to ask my husband for permission first. Jackson agreed, saying it was the right thing to do. Deep down, I knew my husband would never agree to it, but I needed a few more days to think about whether I truly wanted to pursue anything further with Jackson. In our conversation, I noticed how impressed Jackson seemed by my husband, particularly his financial wealth. He expressed his admiration, saying he hoped to achieve the same level of financial freedom one day. I was flattered, of course, even though I wasn't the one with the money. It still felt good to be admired. I had been with my husband for years, through thick and thin, and witnessing his journey from struggling to financially stable was indeed impressive. However, it was bittersweet along the path to financial freedom. It seemed like he had forgotten about me and our relationship. Returning home, I mowed over the conversation. I thought it was really sweet how excited Jackson was about using our private gym. I didn't want to tell him that my husband had said no, so I decided that I didn't have to be in the gym with him all the time. I could just let him work out and leave. I told myself that nothing would happen between us. Despite my best efforts to suppress it, I knew deep down that we would remain just friends helping each other out. However, there was a growing attraction between us that I couldn't ignore. I told Jackson yes, and he was over the moon. He eagerly asked when he could start. I told him he could start whenever he liked. Jackson arrived the next day, and before he came I made a timetable. I wrote down the days I wanted him to come for his workouts. I made a plan like this because I didn't want my husband to come home and find Jackson there. I knew Jackson wouldn't react well, to say the least. However, I didn't tell him why. Instead, I said I wouldn't be around on those days or that I'd be busy with other tasks. Jackson was fine with that. He was very easygoing. He agreed straight away. His job was flexible and he could decide his own hours, as he was a plumber and didn't work for anyone. Jackson started coming over to work out, and at first I tried to keep my distance. I would go over to check on him now and then, but I made sure to maintain some level of separation because I didn't want things to escalate between us. As you can probably guess, that proved to be harder than I thought. Before I knew it, I was crossing boundaries with Jackson. Sometimes I would go over and work out alongside him, enjoying the shared experience and the opportunity to spend time together. Sometimes I'd go to keep him company, enjoying his company despite my internal conflict. There were also moments when I'd bring him drinks, even though I knew he'd brought his own water. It was a small gesture, but it allowed me to feel closer to him and prolong our interactions. We spent a little bit longer together. Jackson was very charming and even told me that he enjoyed our interactions. This went on for a few days, and I was even surprised that Mark hadn't noticed it at all. I guess I was just good at hiding it. One day Jackson came over to our office as usual, but unlike other times he didn't. Instead, he said he wanted to leave early. He said he wanted to stay and keep me company. Jackson and I talked at length and in depth. He said he thought I must be lonely since my husband was always away at work. Jackson said that ever since he had been coming to work at our private gym, he had never once met March. He said that showed I told him how busy Mark was and that I was lonely. I also told him that I was the quiet kid growing up and that I barely had any friends. I explained that I was on good terms with my family, but that we didn't see each other much. Nothing could ever replace seeing them face to face regularly. I tried my best to visit them, but it was usually only during holidays. They made efforts to visit me as well, but their busy work schedules limited their free time. Jackson and I continued chatting, but I can't go into further details because it all happened so quickly. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, we kissed. It was as if every trace of desire and frustration in us was relieved right then. We became intimate right there on the couch. I had finally crossed the boundary. I said I wouldn't have, of course, once the veil of desire had cleared. I realized that what I had done was wrong. I had cheated on my husband, the man I loved. I was attracted to Jackson, but I loved my husband more. We had been through a lot together and no one could replace him in my heart. However, I couldn't deny the intense satisfaction. After getting intimate with Jackson, I felt like all my frustrations had been released. I finally understood how neglected I had been for so long. This was what I had been missing out on. Despite my guilt, I couldn't shake the feeling that my needs mattered too. Like every other foolish, I was the one who cheated. I told myself that what my husband didn't know wouldn't hurt him. I decided that he'd never find out about my indiscretion. I made sure I was always on top of things. I always knew when my husband was due to come home, and I made sure Jackson and I never met on those days. I even informed Jackson of my husband's usual schedule, ensuring that our encounters were carefully timed. It became a routine for us. He would come to the gym and afterwards we would have sex. Despite feeling guilty, I couldn't resist the excitement each time we met. I found it hard to resist the excitement each time we met. It was like a quick fix for the emptiness inside me, even though I knew it was wrong. As time went on, it became harder to keep our affair hidden. I was constantly afraid of getting caught, but I couldn't bring myself to end things with Jackson. I enjoyed the thrill of sneaking around. It was addictive, making me ignore the consequences. Deep down, I knew I was living a lie and betraying my husband and myself. No matter how I tried to justify it, I couldn't escape the truth. I had betrayed the person I loved the most. I guess they say all good things must come to an end, and karma has a way of catching up with you. It was tough, but I honestly thought I'd be the one to end things before they caught up with me. I had this feeling that the moment I felt tired of the chase or sensed my husband was getting suspicious, I'd call it quits with Jackson. I was growing distant from my husband, but I didn't think he was on to me. But then, on the day it all came undone, things started off fine. You know how it is, the worst days often begin with everything seeming okay. My husband had been home the night before, but he had to leave early in the morning, despite the growing distance between us. I still tried to say goodbye to him warmly. He seemed fine, and I had dinner with my husband. I cooked and we watched a bit of a movie before he left. Then Jackson showed up at the gym as usual. I'd noticed he was getting a bit pushy lately. His friendliness had just been a facade, but I was already too deep in this mess to argue or have long conversations with him. I just nodded along. That's when things took a turn for the worse. After Jackson finished his workout, we ended up in the bedroom. I know. I'm married. Please don't judge me. After our intimate moment, Jackson and I started talking as usual. I mentioned that my husband had just left the night before, and Jackson asked if we'd been intimate. I told him no, explaining that I wasn't in the mood and had told my husband as much. Jackson laughed and called my husband a loser, saying he was neglecting his home in pursuit of financial freedom. I wanted to defend my husband because, honestly, I knew he tried his best, no matter how busy he was. Was he always trying to be there for me? But arguing with Jackson didn't seem worth it at that moment. Jackson finished showering and got dressed. He knew I didn't like him lingering around the house too much. I also never walked him to the car because I didn't want any of my neighbors spotting us together. It was pretty unusual since most of the houses were gated, but I didn't want to take any chances. Just a few seconds after Jackson walked out, I heard screaming at the gate. I ran out, thinking maybe Jackson had gotten into some trouble, but to my shock, I found my husband angrily staring at Jackson, who was holding a hammer in his hand. I've never felt so scared in my life. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how much my husband knew and how much I could lie about and get away with it. Did he know why he had a hammer? Did he suspect me elsewhere? Jackson looked terrified. He looked like he was about to faint. I guess my husband finally made his move. I was frozen, shocked, not knowing what to say or do. I just prayed that the neighbors weren't watching and that I could salvage my marriage. Mark finally told Jackson to leave. Jackson drove away as fast as he could. I decided to play it safe and act like nothing had happened. I went over to my husband, welcomed him home and tried to make light of the situation. Mark wasn't having any of it though. He told me never to touch him again and gave me 5 minutes to pack my things and leave. He said I could take my clothes and some important documents. He didn't say anything else. He just screamed at me and said I had stayed silent while Jackson had called him a loser. That's when I realized my husband must have put cameras or microphones in the bedroom. Mark confirmed it, saying he had suspected my infidelity for weeks and had been on to me. He then started shouting at me, saying he wouldn't waste his time with me anymore. Then he got back in his car and drove into the driveway. So began my life was in a downward spiral. Our neighbors, who I'll call shameless for now, started emerging from their gates eager to catch a glimpse of the drama unfolding. They didn't even bother hiding their curiosity, they just stood there staring. I pleaded with Mark as soon as he stepped out of the car, but he wasn't having any of it. I begged, I cried, I did everything I could to salvage our marriage. I love Mark and what happened with Jackson was just a misunderstanding, but he refused to listen. The more I tried to explain, the angrier he got. After a feeble attempt at reason, Mark screamed that my time was up and started throwing my clothes out of the drawer. That's when I realized the situation was serious. I had to leave. I asked for a few more minutes to pack, but Mark was having none of it. I gathered my personal belongings and clothes and left. I held on to a sliver of hope that maybe I could come back and talk things out, but Mark quickly dashed that hope. He told me he was closing our joint account and leaving me with just enough money for a few days in a hotel. He told me to go back to my parents and called me useless, saying I belonged on the streets. Of course I was devastated and I continued crying. I reminded Mark that my parents lived in another state. He softened slightly and acknowledged that that was why he was providing money for a few days at the hotel despite everything. He insisted he wasn't being inconsiderate, but he urged me to leave, and I did. I felt like I was doing the least I could to help him out. I had to go, even if it was just for a few days until my parents could send me money for a ticket home. Mark made it clear we were getting a divorce. He was adamant that not even a divine intervention from heaven could change his mind. He vowed to send divorce papers to me no matter where I ended up. He blocked me so I couldn't go to him. I think Mark had scared him a little too much with the hammer. I told him I wouldn't evade the divorce proceedings. I just didn't want to be homeless. And that was that. So I guess the moral of the story is don't cheat. It will destroy you. Please don't judge me. I know many of you have done far worse than I have. I've had plenty of time to reflect on my actions. I know I was in the wrong. Thanks for listening.